back to order. When we left, we had just closed public testimony on our private cryptographic key legislation. We have some proposed amendment language. We have the original bill for consideration. It's back to committee. Committee, what is your pleasure?
Move the bill.
The bill has been moved. Is there a second?
I'll second, but Mr. Chairman, we actually have someone who's here now that I think would be really just interesting to hear from because she has a criminal prosecution background. She's the general counsel of Kraken. And we had a very interesting conversation, and I think it would be helpful for the committee. I know we've already closed public testimony, but I was about to move reopening public testimony so we can hear from her.
We don't even need to move it. We can, even with this on the table, we can just go ahead and invite her up.
If we could, Mr. Chairman, let's decide on the direction on which amendment we're going to go towards. That way we can have directed question on which amendment we're using.
Mr. Chairman, they're literally the same language, and also prefers the second approach because it's better for statute. So I assume we're going to go, in the end, if we're doing it, we're going to do the second one. So we'll make that assumption, but the language.
One other thing, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to note that Mr. Cole joined us.
Welcome, Mr. Cole.
Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah. Wow. Now we've got an excess of task force members. Yeah. People can go walk around outside. Great. It's great. All right. With that, I would like to invite you up to give us a little perspective on your view of the way we've structured this proposed amendment. It sounds like you've had the opportunity to look over this proposed language, and we welcome you. So please state your name, whom you represent, and welcome.
Did you turn green?
Sure.
Red is okay, red just means slow battery. It's probably working.
Thank you very much for opening the testimony to hear from you this afternoon. We had an opportunity at lunch to talk about some of the debate that occurred about the amendment, and I do feel that I have some perspectives to offer. My name is Mary Beth Buchanan. I'm the general counsel at Kraken. Before taking on this role, which I've held for the last 18 months, I spent 21 years with the U.S. Justice Department prosecuting a whole array of cases of violent crime, like color crime, and representing the government in civil matters. So I think that it's important to know that the government has a broad power to treat different types of property differently in terms of looking at legislation, and legislators have the ability to designate property differently. And there are a lot of statutes that you can look at, whether it's the bankruptcy code or whether it's divorce proceedings, and different states can designate property to be treated differently. And so you can look at a lot of other statutes to see that legislatures do designate different property differently. And I think the topic that we discussed was whether private keys can be treated differently. And I think that looking at the private key, it can be treated differently because it holds an entirety of in some cases, the Bitcoin holding. And so if a court wanted to order that a certain amount of assets be subject to a judgment, turning over a private key might subject that party to turning over a greater amount of assets than what the subject of that court order would be. So I think in your legislation, it would be appropriate to carve out private keys from the type of assets that a court could order be turned over.
Thank you. Any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
That is an exceptional point, and I didn't really, I hadn't really put that into consideration. I was listening to Senator Nethercott, and I certainly understand her point. I disagree with it based on principle, but I kind of wish Senator Nethercott would have heard that, because I think that was pretty devastating. Wow.
Even like thinking about when in criminal cases, for example, if someone has committed a crime and they have defrauded victims. Let's say there's $1 million that victims have suffered a loss, and a court will enter a judgment of $1 million. And the court wants to find $1 million of assets, and they will order that the defendant, be subject to a judgment of $1 million, and they will identify those particular assets, and to earmark those assets, to include a private key in those assets, could potentially subject the individual to losing assets that are over and above the amount that they could be held liable for. So it's one thing to say, you are liable for your, cryptocurrency in the amount of $1 million, which, might satisfy the judgment, but your private key would expose that individual to something far greater than what the amount of the judgment would be.
Mr. Chairman, follow? Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in that scenario, the fear of exposing more than what should be exposed given the order, whatever the order is, pick any scenario, couldn't my attorney just file a motion to say there's more information on here than what we believe you need, and then the opposing counsel would fire back another motion and say, no, we want it all, and then the first attorney would fire back and say, okay, let's do an in-camera review, judge, and the judge would review to make sure, just like in any discovery dispute, right? You're not entitled to this information. Well, am I entitled to it, or am I just on a fishing expedition? What is happening? And in that scenario, wouldn't the current existing law and court system, particularly just the rules of criminal or civil procedures, sort that out by simple?
No, I disagree. I think that we're really talking about two different things. One, the court could order an accounting. The court could order a disclosure, accounting of all of the digital assets that are held, and then those assets could be disclosed, and the location, like whether they're held across different platforms or even different wallets. But giving the key is actually giving access to those assets. And so that is the difference. And I think that the key does have a different property. And that is why I think it can be treated differently.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Any follow-up on that, Representative?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Chairman. I think that.
Just to follow up, because I think that's the key point, is understanding, I think, that the key is, it's key, right? It's going to unlock the information, as opposed to picturing. I think it's difficult because some may picture that there's basically, like a ledger of information, like here is a file and I open it up and then here are all these files and I can pick and choose which ones I want to see and not see, right? But that's not what it looks like when you subject the key to purview.
Mr. Buchanan, response?
I think that would be your public key. So I think that if you disclose that would be the holdings, and you can also subpoena all of the platforms, or you could order the accounting. At Kraken, taking it back to my current position, we receive subpoenas every day to disclose balance sheets of individuals, and we're ordered to do that, and we have to, provide courts with the balances that the individuals hold. But we have never, at least during my tenure, been asked to turn over a private key. I think that this would be an exceptional thing for a court to order, and if Wyoming has the ability to protect a private key, I would urge you to do so.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. My first is, you stated you were a federal prosecutor.
Yes, in my prior career, I spent 21 years as a federal prosecutor and 8 years as United States Attorney in Western Pennsylvania, and a colleague of your former governor, Matt Mead.
So this is where I'm confused, Mr. Chairman. You've changed my opinion of what a federal prosecutor is, because I don't think that right? It doesn't equate in my mind the statements that you've made, so kudos to you. But number two, considering pushback this legislation is most likely to see. What are you doing in February? How's Wyoming?
I'm happy to be here in February. I hear it's beautiful.
It's beautiful. It is open beautiful. We might end up calling in your expertise to testify. Nobody believes a rancher when a rancher says these kinds of things, so it's yeah.
Mr. Buchanan, I have a question. One of the things that, and again, I'm sorry that Senator confused everything also, because one of the points she raised was courts are used to seeing classified material and doing camera review and dealing with sensitive materials, dealing with terrorist actions, and we do have all these things occurring with classified materials every day nationally. And her thought was, so this is the same thing, and a court knows how to handle something with a private key, and will do so. What are your thoughts on that? Why is this different?
Quite honestly, I would be very concerned about turning over a private key to a court. As we all know, the difficulty of handling such a thing, that there are chances of it being mishandled, being lost. Evidence is lost all the time. I think that the important thing is that the court have an accounting of what the assets are, and that the court have the ability to order that those assets be turned over, that the assets may even be paid into the court, which I would certainly support, and I think that the court has every right to do that. But to turn over the private key itself could have devastating effects to the entire assets of a particular individual.
Hey, Mr. Buchanan, one other question along those lines is you've had a tremendous amount of experience with the courts as a prosecutor dealing with cases, I'm sure, no doubt, within camera review and lots of different circumstances. When we talk about the courts and when we speculate, a lot of times we kind of make an assumption that if two lawyers challenge each other, file motions, fight back and forth, that the right decision gets made at the end. And that the judge is going to say, all right, well, once the motions are filed, the judge will finally say, all right, well, it makes perfect sense to me. I've listened to all the experts. I don't need to see the private key. I'm satisfied with the public key and the list of assets, so we'll make the right choice. And that's what we hope. Do you feel fully confident that every time the court and the lawyers would end up not asking to see the private key?
I just don't believe that there's any reason that the court would need to see the private key. What the court needs to validate is that the assets exist.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, Mr. Coffin, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, just one quick question. Thank you for the comments, Ms. Pia. And I tend to agree with you. I think that the protection of the private key is important, but I'm just curious, do your comments apply to both civil and criminal context? Or do you feel differently about criminal versus the civil context?
Yeah, I would say they do apply to both civil and criminal. Obviously, in a criminal context, courts have a higher ability to seize assets. The standards are different. They have the ability to seize them pre-judgment, where in a civil matter that there has to be a judgment first. But no, I would still assert that it is not necessary for the private key to be turned over in either civil or criminal litigation.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Mr. Coffin? Me? Any additional questions? Mr. Buchanan, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
That's great.
All right, so we are still on the bill. I guess we'll re-close. We have a motion. You have a second. And Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move option number 2 in regards to the amendment to 20 LSO 163 version 4.
We have a motion to adopt option 2. Is there a second? We have a motion from Co-Chairman Linton, and I believe it was a second from Ms. Long, if I'm not mistaken. Discussion on adopting option 2 and amending the bill.
Question.
No discussion. Question to call. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. We're back on the bill as amended, 20 also 163 version 4 as amended. Discussion. Question.
Question on the,
Question's been called. Roll call, please.
Senator Driscoll is excused. Senator Nethercott
Is excused.
excused. Representative Olson.
Aye.
Representative Ian.
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman.
Aye.
Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Ms. Long.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Lindholm.
aye.
Co-Chairman Rothfuss.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I think we'd be undecided on where that's going to go. I mean, it would make sense to send that to the Corporations Committee. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Happy to submit to corporations, definitely not fund minerals.
Corporations it is. All right.
Corporations. All right. It looks like lunch is next. Let's skip ahead. The next topic for consideration is corporate digital identity. We're still early to some degree in this process, but we have asked Mr. Allen to provide a demonstration of Wyoming corporate digital identity, decentralized identity industry. Before we go to that, Representative Yin, if you want to make any comments on sort of work that's been accomplished and how things have proceeded as you brought together folks to talk about digital identity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have, I believe, two presentations, one from Mr. Allen and one from Ms. Channing. I'd love to see them both. I think we're just interested in seeing what are the possibilities with decentralized identity and where we can go with that in digital identification. I don't think we have any concrete proposals. It's really just more of seeing what's out there, what's possible, and maybe seeing how we can apply that to what it is.
Thank you, Representative Yin. Any questions for Representative Yin before we move forward? Yes, Mr. Chair. All right. Just comment. Go ahead with the comment.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would just ask that, because we are running behind, and that is 100% the task force's fault, but we do have a hard stop. Some of us do at 3:30. I would ask that the presenters whip through if you could. Sorry.
So my name is Christopher Allen. I'm with Blockchain Commons. I'm going to be speaking about opportunities of Wyoming corporate digital identity. I'm the executive director and architect for Blockchain Commons. We're an infrastructure benefit, social benefit organization. We're really trying to establish a basis for this. I am here representing not my specific interests, but this interest of the larger decentralized identity community, specifically developers in the World Wide Web Consortium, the Decentralized Internet Foundation, and Hyperledger Indy. So these are very large groups of people with differing approaches, but are unified and committed to using decentralized blockchain solutions there. I do want to point out to Representative Lindholm, sorry, is that Hyperledger Indy is a different project than the IBM Fabric one. So this is the third community I'm talking about here is not the IBM Fabric community. These are some of the organizations that are committed to this particular architecture and approach. This is about a 1.5-year old slide. I don't have a current one. It's gotten much larger in the last couple of weeks. The verifiable claims has moved to be a global standard, and the decentralized identifier specification has moved into being initial drafts to be, again, a formal standard. So why are we discussing this? Well, last year you passed a bill that basically said by the end of 2021, the Secretary of State shall endeavor to use blockchain technology for all of the documents, reports, data that they currently have, and if possible, partner with technology innovators and private companies to develop the components of that system. There is no requirement under this law to actually deliver it by 2021, and that I think we should try to address and see if we can help accelerate that. It will help all the other bills that you've been working on, HB 101, passed HB 101, the other bills, etc. So I wanted to show you the demo. Let's see, switch. here to the video. So to save time, we made a quick video of this so that we didn't have to go through all the little stuff. So this is a 7-minute video. I believe audio should be on, and
hello and welcome to the State of Wyoming Commercial Registered Agent Demo Flow with Verus Identity. Today we're going to first start with creating a personal profile for Kim Registrar. For the profile name, we'll use agent, since she wants to be a commercial registered agent. Her first name is Kim, last name, Registrar. Then we'll go next. So here we'll review the information we inputted to create our personal profile for Verus Wallet. We successfully created a profile. In that process, we created a decentralized identifier for Kim, as well as private keys for Kim as well, that she'll use to sign credentials in the future. Next, we'll go to the State of Wyoming website to go pick up a commercial registered agent credential. Here we'll select the commercial registered agent credential issued by the State of Wyoming. Now we will authenticate using our wallet to transfer our credentials to the State of Wyoming. Here we can see the credentials that the State of Wyoming is requesting. And if we feel that this request is sufficient, we'll click Share. Now we'll fill out our application to receive our commercial registered agent credential. Our legal name is Kim Registrar. We'll go ahead and put our address. And then click Next. Here's the review page. We want to make sure that the credential that you want to pick up looks okay. We can see the Wyoming Secretary of State logo. We see that the Wyoming Secretary of State is listed as the issuer. We have a nice description about what a commercial registered agent credential is, and then the claims that the credential is making. Our legal name and our address. Now we'll click Finish.
So business process happens here, there's a vetting process, whatever they currently do, they would continue to do.
We can go right here and click Store Credentials to store them in our wallet. Now this window pops up and says, would you like to store these credentials? Let's look for more information. As you can see, it's still the same data, and now we want to store this commercial registered agent credential in our wallet. So we'll go ahead and click Store. Looks like our credential has been stored in the wallet. Let's go back to our wallet and see if we can see that credential. There it is. Here is the commercial registered agent credential that we picked up from the Secretary of State of Wyoming. So what we had before was just the commercial registered agent credential. And now you can see that there's an organization credential. We have an applicant who applied Kim Registrar Service as a commercial registered agent to have Kim file for the incorporation documents for their company. So if we click on organization credential, we'll see that the legal name of the organization is Acme LLC. Entity type is Limited Liability Company, and the address is 321 Broad Street, Cheyenne, Wyoming 82001, US. So now we're going to go back to the State of Wyoming website. And here, we're going to let Kim, on the behalf of Acme LLC, file on the State of Wyoming's website to receive the Certificate of Incorporation from the State of Wyoming. Again, we will authenticate. We'll select, again, the agent profile. And now the State of Wyoming is requesting the organization's credential as well as who the commercial registered agent is. That looks okay. So we'll share. And we'll click next. The legal name of the organization is, in fact, Acme LLC. The entity type is a limited liability company. Does this look okay? That legal name looks okay, and then the entity type looks okay as well.
So once again, business process happens, whatever review they currently do happens,
All right.
articles.
Our certificate of incorporation credential is ready for pickup. So we'll go ahead and store this credential in our wallet. Would you like to store these credentials? We can look at this drop down and also look at some more detailed information of the credentials, store them, and then that's it. We should then be able to go back to our wallet, click refresh, and then see the certificate of incorporation credential now in our wallet.
Okay, so back to my slides. So this demo was real code on a real blockchain. This particular one was Veris1. There are at least 3, maybe even 4 or 5 other companies that could very easily do this demo as well. You will see one shortly from Consensus Import that can also do processes like this. These companies already have similar types of corporate or commerce-oriented and individual-oriented verifiable credentials and decentralized identifier projects in process right now. So this is not, this isn't just an animation from a web designer. So I wanted to real briefly,
Bottom right.
bottom, okay. Okay, so real quick, what are verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers? Well, we start off with credentials. Everybody has a number of credentials. They confer authority, status, rights, etc. They consist of a subject, they consist of an issuer, and evidence associated with it. The advantage of digital credentials is they're tamper-proof and thus they're more trustworthy. They can be combined with other credentials to allow for much more complex things, and they can be transmitted over long distances. This is one of the reasons why Homeland Security is interested in this, because they know they can't issue credentials, say, to a Chinese company, because the Chinese company is going to conform with Chinese credentials, or British Columbia that the goods are passing through. So they want to have some way to be able to do these things at a distance and yet still be able to rely on them. So the key thing that traditional sort of centralized systems have is these identifiers are centralized. They can be taken away from you. They're in effect leased to you. They're loaned to you. They're misused commercially. Government really doesn't want you to use Social Security numbers. It actually costs them lots, on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. The fact that Social Security numbers are used overly broadly. They have lots of costs associated with privacy and security. So we're going to fix that with the ability to create many identifiers for many different types of things that are portable, don't require centralized authority, are protected by cryptography, and enable privacy and data portability. So that is the decentralized identifier. It's global, it's highly available, verifiable, and no centralized authority. So what you have here is an issuer, issues credentials to the holder. A verifier can identify them. They do this by talking to a decentralized identifier on a blockchain. And we support many kinds of blockchains. Depending on what your needs are, you might support one or the other, or more ideally most. So all the important ones you might want to support. Looks like this, but this is like an IP address or even a telephone number. Hopefully users will never see this number, but it's the underlying thing that we're protecting cryptographically. We can use it for lots of stuff, individuals and organizations. You just saw Kim was an individual. Organizations was the Acme LLC. It can also include things like devices and cars and other things. It's registered on a decentralized network. Wallet applications control it. Ultimately, you get public keys and places to be able to communicate with the authority who has that device. In general, you don't put personal metadata on a DID. That you go to an endpoint, you get authorization, just like you saw. Even the State Department didn't immediately get Kim Registrar's credential because she had to grant permission to give her address on. These are just some of the implementations today. As you can see, the first two are on the Bitcoin network. The next two are on the Ethereum network. Then we have a variety of other, so that I think the next two are not really blockchains at all, but are DLTs. And then we have two permission networks that have different properties. Sovereign is permission, but they have a whole lot of zero knowledge stuff that they can do to further protect personal privacy. And then Veris1 is the one that we just looked at. This is a small list of the number of ones that are being proposed right now and executed on, but these are some of the leaders. There's increasing international support. British Columbia has already issued over 534,000 business entity DIDs for the British Columbia companies, and over 1.4 million verifiable credentials, which is everything from being a new company or that you're licensed to do something in British Columbia. The Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is now talking about adopting this universally across Canada. Holland, Malta, Sierra Leone, United Nations, other places are all doing pilots. I'm sure the consensus, Emma will be able to talk about cities and other places that are also using this technology. So US government is actually interested in this as well. They're basically dealing with a lot of issues of crossing the borders. They want to improve supply chain management. They want to combat counterfeit goods. And they basically testified before the House of Representatives that they wish everybody to use decentralized identifiers, verifiable claims, and decentralized key management. So they're championing in general that all the people that are using these should use interoperable standards and specifications, that they should be patent-free, royalty-free, and free to implement. So that is not part of your requirements in your original bill around this, but they're suggesting that you should have that as a requirement. That you should avoid vendor-led lock-in. Don't choose one company or one blockchain. Be able to be flexible because of the use of the standards. Be able to support multiple ones. Those particular technologies they've reviewed. They've invested millions of dollars in research to try to make sure that they're secure and meet the government's needs. They're doing it for free trade agreements with certificates of origin. I know Veris1 is doing one of those. Other official licenses and certificates from Homeland Security. This has all been funded by the U.S. Department of Homeland Services, and I know that I know the sovereign folks and the companies are all kind of jockeying to, puzzle through, how to, begin piloting these in these areas. I know Homeland Security, Neil John had sent you a slide deck saying why they were interested in Wyoming supporting these standards, and he couldn't make it to this particular session. There was one other point. Oh, anyhow, it's real. And now this is a basis. Once you have a digital birth certificate for a company, then that allows for a lot of the other things that you have authorized, the ability to create stock ledgers of tokens that can all be signed by the fact that it is a real company in Wyoming because of the keys that are in the EID document for that company. All of this stuff then becomes a foundation in which you can build additional credentials, additional authority to do different types of business, not just in Wyoming, but worldwide. So I encourage consideration in trying to make this happen for you. Do you want to do general Q&A first, or do you want Emma to come up and talk?
Well, let's go back to committee real quick and see if there are any questions before we have Emma come up. Committee, any questions? No? Yeah, go ahead.
Chairman, thanks. So a big question I had is around, a lot of this depends on what blockchain we choose, or we theoretically would choose to do this, and let's just take Ethereum, for example, or Ethereum. How would a system like this account for, say, another smart contract hack, which causes the ledger to no longer be immutable, and there's reorgs and rollbacks where presumably there's some or hundreds or thousands of transactions that have taken place on this presumably immutable blockchain, and how would the Secretary of State's office or the vendors that they're working with deal with something like that?
So
Maybe just go ahead, Mr. Allen.
So my honest advice to the Secretary of State and to the future legislative guidance around these types of things is don't choose one. Literally, I think you should do an RFP that says, we expect you to have compatibility with at least one or two other blockchains. So you would maybe choose, whatever you think that of the four that I know can do it right now, or maybe 5 or 6 more by the time January comes around. Say that you have to demonstrate compatibility for a minimum of 2, and we recommend 3. And that way you're not stuck. If there happens to be some kind of catastrophe on Ethereum and there's another, kind of dowish rollback because of a thing, there, certificates can be issued on Veris1 or on Bitcoin that serve the same purpose. So you just revoke the certificates you don't need on blockchains that fail you. So I don't want the Department of State to have to make a decision there. We don't have some choice.
Paul, let's go.
Sure, thanks. So on multiple blockchains, then, already on one, over a centralized system, the transaction costs are orders of magnitude higher than a centralized system. And then trying to duplicate that on multiple blockchains, this seems not to account for just like building it and things like that, just transactions themselves. If you're having to multiply this over several blockchains, just seems immeasurably more expensive than a centralized system.
So,
Mr. Allen, go ahead.
So to be clear, this is all of these things have been addressed by the different blockchain methods, different forms of batching, Merkle trees, things of that nature. Microsoft has a new second layer, so it only settles to Bitcoin, which costs money, after thousands or tens of thousands of transactions are done based on the load of the minute. So at most every 10 minutes. Their goal is to be able to support the entire Windows ecosystem with everybody having a DID, being able to have many verifiable credentials associated with those, and be able to scale economically for regular users. As you said, some of the permission chains can do that a lot cheaper. This particular chain that was in this demo is a permission chain, trying to make sure that these issues of scaling and security are addressed.
Oh, Mr. Cole.
Thank you. So yeah, the permission chains make sense to be a lot cheaper. Under what definition of decentralized would that be a decentralized sort of option?
So, I apologize. This is an open issue. What the DID standards group that has basically been chartered to do is create something called a decentralized method rubric by which you can evaluate the needs of your particular use case against the various proposals that are out there. And every method, whether or not they're in Bitcoin or whatever, has to describe their particular solutions, because there are trade-offs in all of this. So yeah, ETCR, which is a fairly primitive one, but doesn't require a second layer, is extremely decentralized, but you're talking whatever the Bitcoin costs are, which is substantial last year. You use the ION system, which is also Bitcoin-based, is significantly less expensive, but you're using Microsoft, and you don't like Microsoft. So all these things are different trade-offs. What you want is a nice, reliable rubric that you can basically ask the questions of each of the methods and then make your own decision, and hopefully in a little bit of variety. And I think maybe you should choose one permission, one non-permissioned, and maybe one other, just so that you are covering your bases. Because it doesn't cost anything. The business process is the real cost to the State Department. The fact that they, under the table, they actually issue 3 credentials, nobody should care about. Because they're representing exactly the same information, or 3 DIDs.
Mr. Cole, anything else? Good? All right, Ms. Long, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Allen. 2 thoughts. One, does it matter if Wyoming Secretary of State does something different than Delaware Secretary of State? Should there be uniformity across the different Secretaries of State? And more importantly, as I think you know, the issue that really hit me in the core and got me so focused on the blockchain as a solution to it in the first place is the inaccurate bookkeeping of Wall Street's ledger systems, which lose track of who owns what. And under the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 8, securities companies have special status that they're allowed to issue securities that have not been, to sell you something that has not been legally issued. So one of the reasons that I think this technology is so powerful in the securities industry is that you should be able now, through technology, to do an API call to verify that the share of stock that you're buying is actually legally issued. So you don't have these crazy Dole Food situations where they have 1/3 more shares legally issued than were, sorry, 1/3 more shares outstanding than were actually legally and validly issued. I know from working with Secretary of State of Delaware years back, this happens all the time. How can we make sure that the new securities market that is arising based on blockchain incorporates some sort of an API call to verify that the securities were validly issued before you purchase them?
Thank you, Ms. Long. Mr. Allen?
Yes, so part of the reason why I've been really emphasizing this, and I think this is one of the things that originally brought me here 2 years ago, was to do this as a baseline, is that we in effect have a tree of trust where ultimately at the end we have the keys that are held by the holder, in this case the company or the individual, who collects a variety of credentials and claims that they can be evaluated against. And a lot of those types of trust assumptions ultimately at some point when you're walking through come down to, is there a company behind it? That is, so once we have the company, then we can, issue other different types of things like, yes, they have been certified to issue tokens in Wyoming. Then the tokens can maybe get a certification of another kind that, they pass the Howey test and have, no action from the SEC or whatever. Those things can all be put into place. And then once you have that, you have the ability to do various kinds of proof of reserves, proof of, all the other cryptographic proofs. But you need this sort of, some of these bottom layer things of trust. And this is one of the important ones.
Ms.
Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Allen. Let's move on to Ms. Channing's presentation next, please. That was part of the presentation?
Okay, so I'm just going to get the platform up. See if I can switch it through. Technology issues. Hey Jazz, do you want to come up and see if you can fix this while I talk? In theory, that should. So, I'm going to probably mangle this. My name is Emma Channing. I am an attorney affiliated with Consensus. Predominantly, my role there is as a kind of registered rep at the broker-dealer, which is Consensus Digital Securities. We consult across a wide range of technology. We think that, so why I wanted to bring this up as I kind of introduced is that we're going to be demoing Uport. Uport Lander is a website that anyone can go to. This is the app on the App Store, so just while I'm introducing, if anyone wants to download it, you can. Digital identity is incredibly important. The fight is not lost. Identity and data is being generated all of the time. And so the technology is at a really fulcrum point where there is choices to be made. Consensus, if it has Consensus has many internal flaws, but one of them is that we're not the best at promoting ourselves. But I should start by saying that when we talk about vendor lock-in, when we talk about these kind of issues, what you should be thinking about is the developer community and the number of nodes that blockchain is distributed across. Hyperledger Indy is a blockchain that's sovereign developed specifically for sovereign, donated at Philomex Foundation, and it sits alone. Bitcoin is decentralized, yes, but it doesn't have an application there. Ethereum is unique in that way. And because of this application there and its particular functionality, the developer community globally, just on public Ethereum, is 30 times larger than the nearest developer community. And that is the Bitcoin community. So you're talking about a hugely different pool of talent to be able to develop these technologies. What's more, many companies have embraced Ethereum and in particular work with Consensus. So EY in May launched Nightfall, which is a private transaction Ethereum-based code. Quorum, and then open sourced it. Quorum is a JPM effort, which is a fork of Ethereum, and it's also open sourced. Turning around to digital identity, specifically Uport has been around for 5 years, and it is developed and built out in several places. Specifically, Zug, and we've seen sort of more interest in digital identity and protecting data and personal identity outside of the US rather than inside. And Zug was the first to deploy Newport. It is used for everything from citizenship to bikes. So to come back up front, Newport round here is just a demonstration of what we think can be done. It's built out, it's there, but what we would say about digital identity is yes, but the corporate applications are a huge sort of friction-free point, which are interesting for municipalities, but ultimately you've always got to start with the individual, and that's where we would focus. And before I kind of dive into walking you through Newportlandia, what I would say is there are colleagues of mine here who are much better versed to talk about this. Austin Griffith from Civil and Gatecoin. EJAZ works on digital identity as well as DeFi and other things. Matt Corber is our general counsel. And we will cheerfully come out to Wyoming in smaller groups whenever you want to discuss anything that you do want. So Newportlandia is an example of how an individual could interact with the municipality. Some of this I won't be able to show you, so let me log out of it. So I have already scanned in, so I'm just going to, so I've got Newportlandia up on my phone. So I'm just going to read the QR code with my phone, which is connected to my ID on my phone. And agree to login. And then here I could go through and so on and enter all my information. I can go through and get verified. I can go through and get a city ID. That city ID can then be associated with my graduate certificates and other such things. I'm sensitive to the time that we've got. I would encourage everyone to get to the website, have a play with it, see the functionality. But the most important thing I can say to you is that rather than look to what other government identity solutions have been, I would think about what the global developer community looks like, what the in-house developer community looks like. To be honest, it's Ethereum. It's the nature of the application layer, and it's the nature of the usability.
Hey, Michelle, you want to come up and join us up here and see if we have any questions? Mr. Allen, welcome to the table. Any questions for Ms. Channing? Richard? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to remind me, Ms. Channing, Newport is built on Ethereum, is that correct?
It's open source. There are certain parts of Newportlandia which are proprietary, but we're always happy to put that in a code lock, and that's accessible in future consensus and Newport efforts.
Go ahead, Coach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to the cost of gas for Ethereum, and one of the bigger concerns in this area is, the cost over length of time. What are you seeing per transaction with Newport?
Go ahead, Shannon.
It would be less than 2 cents, and gas is designed to not go up over time, fractionally speaking. For example, we've done the Cowboy Coin here on a much smaller scale, but when we did it in Denver, we processed approximately $40,000 worth of food transactions. The overall cost, I believe, was about 5 cents.
Mr. Chairman, just to kind of give a little background on that, because it was a huge amount of transactions that shook out at ETH Denver. So they had like 20 different drugs. And when you showed up at ETH Denver and you registered, you got one of the coins from Eat Denver where you could use Uport to basically purchase your food from those food trucks. So it was a pretty fascinating experience. QR codes on each food truck. You just walk down the line, I'm gonna have some fish and chips, scan it, and boom, make your payment. And so all of that was done through Uport. So it's kind of a fascinating use of tech to feed people at Eat Denver.
Ms. Channing? Paul?
Chairman, I don't know the exact number of transactions, but this is about, even just the food trucks and the cargo coin, it is about data. It's about giving data back to small businesses. Visa, MasterCard are never going to disclose the amount of data that we provided back to the food trucks about what was sold, when it was sold, how they could be sure that that was exactly what their total was at the end of the day. These things are incredibly important, and I think we at Consensus feel the real heartbeat of time and history looking at us. That we sit on a real fulcrum here about whether we're going to be able to get this technology into the hands of people in a truly decentralized way that protects their future identity. There are organizations that have done huge damage to personal and small business and large business data. And there is a real chance to change it.
Additional questions?
So one thing I was curious about, this demo here, I was playing with a little bit also while you were showing it up there. Can you talk us through a little bit of the use case? This is a theoretical city, I don't know what Randy here, but why would Laramie, for example, Laramie, Wyoming, why would Laramie dive in and put together a Uport system and build identities associated with it? What's the current adoption case at a smaller scale than kind of this very large case that we're looking at?
And again, I have to emphasize that I am the least qualified person from Consensus to talk about this, and we are very happy as Consensus to come back and speak in smaller groups and so on. The reasons are threefold. From a municipality point of view, it is reducing back office and creating greater certainty and a lack of fraud. So, for example, we're here on this beautiful campus of this amazing university. If I'd gone all the way through Newport that year, I would have been able to have, as part of my visual identity, if I was a graduate of, say, Laramie, that would then become part of my visual identity. Again, I'm going to mangle this, and I have colleagues here who can better speak to it, but one of the things that we do think is very important about digital identity is that you don't use it for single purposes. From an individual point of view, your digital identity is just related to your citizenship and your bank accounts and your payments, not pointing to the organization currently pushing that, but when you push social data and just payment data into one honeypot, you create a real point of risk. But when that digital identity is used for other things, such as Uport is, and can be used for everything from citizenship all the way to unlocking rights and currently isn't. And Uport lands here as an example, if you work all the way through the website, of having various different functionalities attached to that digital identity, and it makes it much harder to be a single point of attack.
So Mr. Allen was discussing a series that should be part of a digital identity framework, and one of those really was the idea that you would have multiple blockchains and basically interoperability of standards so that there can be communication and mutual verification among digital identity provider types. What does the scalability of this look like? And this is a challenge, I think, as we get into digital identity for the state of Wyoming. We certainly don't want to pick a digital identity, we're the first ones out the door, and then we pick data, and everyone else went with VHS, and then to conform later on. What can you tell us about the approach here with Uport based on that concern, where this is a hard one to lead in because we have to make sure that we're interoperable?
I would point to 2 or 3 things, and Chris is itching to respond, and let him respond next. But I think I would point to 2 or 3 things. There is, as consensus, we are not very good at demonstrating the enormous adoption of the theory. The public development community is 30 times larger than the Bitcoin development community. And the main reason for that is that Bitcoin was never designed to be anything other than a payment. It was never designed to have an application rested on top of it. That wasn't Satoshi's vision. It was a breakpoint idea, but Vitalik's extraordinary strength was, 5 years later to go, oh, we should build the web on top of the internet. And that is essentially what Ethereum is. It is open source, and I pointed you to EOS Nightfall, JPM's Core. These are all open sourced, massive applications based on Ethereum. And I think people tend to throw around the interoperability, but Hyperledger Indy isn't even interoperable with Hyperledger. Like, interoperability is something that unfortunately for your time frame is 5 years down the road. We're eventually going to get there, but this isn't like talking about different pieces of Microsoft speaking to other pieces of Microsoft. This is things that don't even have an application layer and are just protocols trying to talk to things that do. And we will get there, and we are working with Hyperledger Indy, and these things will improve, but it's a 3 to 5 year time.
Okay, Mr. Allen, would you like to follow up too?
So, I'm not a member of Consensus, but I will say, they are a member of the Decentralized Internet Foundation. The Decentralized Internet Foundation is the executive director now is Reuben Heck, who is one of the founders of Consensus and is basically employed by them. And they've set it as a major milestone this quarter to start providing interoperability between the different DID methods that are there. So Emily's correct that the sovereign community is in a different organization, and they're not necessarily participating in interoperability things that DIF is, but Microsoft is. There's one is Consensus, et cetera. So this is, I think, a number of these companies are in a good position to be able to deliver, individual solutions. Consensus has, this good background and experience from having done Zoop for a couple of years. This is, a step up municipality-wise. Other people have other strengths. And of course, Microsoft is Microsoft. Once it's in Windows, it'll be interesting. I think my goal as a leader in this industry is it's too soon to pick. And that's why I'm pushing DIF and W3C and the Sovereign Foundation to all, reconcile these ideas, because the whole design of decentralized identifier was, in the end, you shouldn't see it. You shouldn't care that underneath, your issuer of a particular credential has decided to use a particular blockchain for their particular needs. What you want to be able to know is that verifiable credential valid, and can I use that in my business processes? And that is possible, and we can begin to do it soon.
So on that last point, that was my next question. We don't have legislation on this, and we've been talking about it for 2 years, really, if not longer, on how to move this forward in Wyoming. We have the work with the Secretary of State's office where we're trying to move down this path. But it's a little bit of a challenge for us from a policy standpoint to really make choices on what we should do to move forward, because there are still so many unknowns in terms of what direction things will go. So the question I'll have, I think, for both of you and anyone else that wants to provide testimony is, what could we be doing now to move Wyoming into a digital identification space
that isn't going to quickly become antiquated, but is going to be a positive benefit to both provide incentive to the industry to develop, which is a good thing, and then also benefit the people of Wyoming, which is once again great.
So, I again refer you back to the Homeland Security's thing here. There are some outlier companies who claim that they're supporting, decentralized solutions and things of that nature, but are not actively involved with the standards organizations that are actually trying to make it and prove and have test cases for these types of things. So if I was to add something where you currently say you suggest that it be blockchain solution in HB 70, that you be more specific that it needs to support standards, and UPort is supporting standards, Averis One, several other organizations are. And then the next step is say that in your RFP you must support two. There's nothing. So we use very common crypto. I don't believe that there's any reason why Microsoft's verifiable credentials and UPort's verifiable credentials can't verify each other very quickly, because they're using the same method for it. They're in the same they're in the same development organization, DIF, that is doing it. So I think they're in a good position to be able to do that. But right now, nobody's demanding you guys interoperate. You being Wyoming being one of the first organizations, buyers of this capability, to say no. You guys have to work together. You can't go alone. And I think that'll strengthen the whole industry.
Thanks. Committee, additional questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Just real quickly about voting. The Secretary of State of West Virginia has implemented blockchain-based voting for absentee and overseas military voting. And I just saw you put out a press release yesterday, I think, about some changes to international postal cooperation that are going to make absentee voting for overseas citizens and military serving overseas even more difficult, which is sort of pushing the whole voting process towards technology. Have you looked at what West Virginia has done, and do you have a view on the pilot that they've done? It's very narrow, it's for overseas and military only, and presumably it's easier to validate the identity of a military member, but I'm just curious if you have a view on that, because that is one place, Mr. Chairman, where we've seen other states actually moving.
Thank you, Ms. Long. Mr. Allen?
I mean, voting is definitely a challenging area in a couple of regards. One of which is that for fair voting, there's an anonymity that has to be required. Otherwise, it can be coerced. I do know that UPort allows for certain kinds of polling that has happened in Zoom. I know some other people that are doing some things there. Would I say that is as mature as the verifiable credential, the ability to issue the credentials? I would say no. That is absolutely on the roadmap for these decentralized technologies to be able to offer these types of things. So it's one thing to poll your residents in, the dorm of whether or not, Friday should be pizza, and another thing that, for, an elected representative. So we'll get there.
Okay, Mr. Allen, Ms. Chang, you have?
Thank you, Chairman. We're very familiar with the West Virginia pilot. There was one other using that particular technology. It has some flaws. We are currently working on a blockchain-based voting system. There are a number of ways that we as consensus can approach it, and we haven't yet determined that. But that's definitely something that we think is incredibly important, particularly when we look back at the 2016 election and at the issues experienced. Just as an opportunity, in case I don't have the chance to say this again, you can't emphasize enough how important that verifiable credentials are good, but data is still expected to be held by a centralized authority when you are looking at smaller numbers of nodes. Some of the technologies that are being presented today have 20 or less nodes. Ethereum is spread across thousands. It's just a different landscape.
Thank you, Jim. Any further questions? Further public comment? Mr. Cole, looks like you go.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With this particular concept you're thinking about, would it be open to third-party wallets? Like, the reason why I'm asking that is because some of the services that you're offering, and I've got some suggestions or possibilities to that, it would make sense that other third-party developers would be able to take advantage of the accreditation of this for their particular wallet purposes.
Well, I mean, honestly, that's the whole purpose, is trying to get to the point where we have an authoritative digital identity service, which then authenticates corporations in Wyoming, identities in Wyoming, and obviously beyond. We don't want to be limited to Wyoming, but this is where we're at, this is where we're trying to get going. And then the vision of this model, which Ms. Channing and Mr. Allen presented, is then you will have third-party interoperability. You'll have the idea of certification authority, where I vouch that this individual has a degree from the University of Wyoming. I vouch that this individual was employed by me and my corporation for 3 years from 1985 to 88. You basically have credentials then that get tagged to either the corporate entity or the individual entity. And then the vision also is, now when I come and meet with you and I present you with my credentials, I don't show you anything I don't want to show you. Right. So the example that we've used in testimony a lot is when you go and you go into the supermarket and you're buying beer, and you go up to the counter and you show them your ID. They don't need anything on that ID except for a simple binary of, are you old enough? Yes? No? So it would be nice with a digital identity if you got to walk up to the counter and they say, yeah, give me your ID, and all you had to do was validate. So they have to have proof of your identification link, and then yes, you are 21, but then they don't have enough information to follow you home later that day, which would be great.
You know, in that interest, I know that the federal government does trademarks, but is there a reason why they have to have a monopoly on that? So, like, Wyoming could move forward to copyrights, trademarks, patents, and utilizing a system similar to this to be able to prove that without the centralization and monopolistic control of the federal government's trademarks and patent office.
I think there might be some federal preemption challenges there, but I see what you're saying. I mean, anywhere we can, we would certainly be able to do that, and there would be a distributed network of authenticating services for various attributes depending on what somebody wanted to authenticate. With respect to trademark and copyright, I'm pretty sure we're preempted like crazy. In fact, it's a constitutionality even there on it. But I get your point. Yeah. is absolutely.
Well, that should be decentralized too.
Yeah. It should. Fortunately, we can't pass that law, but I'm wrong.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here. Any additional public comments on this topic of, we've kind of blended corporate and individual digital identity a little bit, so we're merging these two topics. Please don't forget us. Oh, you want to participate? I'm sorry, my apologies. One moment.
Sorry.
Please introduce yourself once again and welcome.
My name is Annette and I'm from Market High. My concern is that we've especially seen it in this last year, that it's been coming for quite some time. I don't know exactly the specifics, but Christopher Allen's talking about dealing with Microsoft. But when you start getting big companies like that, you have agendas. You have hidden motives. And when you have them connected to people's businesses, private information, it's very scary. It could just disappear. Or all of a sudden you're flagged. And if we come into the programs of what's going on in China, where you have a social number, you're good or bad, and if companies like Microsoft and other things like this get a hold of this, it could be detrimental to a company that's legitimate, that they have their own agenda, whatever it is, whether it's yours or not. And so your company could disappear. It could have, like right now, there's the BBB, it could have a bad rating, which it may never really have, but that's what they're either their AI or their engineering, or however you want to word it, is dealt with. And companies shouldn't have other companies controlling their information, especially when you have dealings with Microsoft or Google or any of those things.
Any questions on this? I think there's a few different issues wrapped into that. One is whether you have a central authority that's managing these digital identities or not. I think everything we're talking about is trying to have as distributed as possible of that digital identity. In fact, I think the ideal is that nobody really owns your digital identity, but you've got the ability to challenge for credentials with that digital identity, which is a nice approach. But even with that, you still run the risk of what you're talking about, where if I do have a digital identity, a presence where I've got my own unique identifier, there is going to be nothing that precludes you, but this kind of gets into free speech a little bit. As long as I can identify you, I can still hang up something which says, I don't like this entity for whatever reason. I don't know how to work around that, but it's an interesting challenge.
I don't either, and I think we have to be very careful if you guys are looking at a company to take that into consideration of where are these connections and who has access to this data and can control it.
Good points. The access and control should be on my authentication authorization. I believe with these models, I think that's accurate. And I can, all the models that I've had discussions about allow me to, which is great, repeal that authorization at some point as well. That's kind of essential. But making sure we actually get all of these features in the final product is certainly part of the challenge of this. So, excellent point.
So was this type of thing that happened, I guess I'm kind of trying to understand, are you guys trying to get ideas from these different companies and make a decision on it? Or what was the basis?
Oh,
I'm trying to understand.
this is a future exploration here, right? We know this is an important policy issue, and we also, based on the last couple of years of testimony, have not really come down to exactly what we should do for a path forward. But one thing that we've done, we've taken action, which Mr. Allen presented some language about, was some legislation that directed our Secretary of State's office to come up with a digital identifier for corporations, for corporate filing, so that we could start having some of these authentications and digital identification features with our business community and through the Secretary of State's office. So that's something that we'll be working on over the next couple of years. We haven't put our RFP or anything yet, and we're looking for input at this point. We're trying to figure out what direction to go.
Could there be something where you set up a grant or a competition for local Wyoming companies to create something like this?
Do it at Hackathon. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, I think Ms. Long sponsored one of the competitions that specifically goes towards best use case for the state of Wyoming. And I think that was a $5,000 prize. Is that correct, Ms. Long?
Ms. Long?
Mr. Chairman. Yes, that's correct. I did it again this year, and I believe last year the winner was a filing system for the Secretary of State.
Yeah, it was. So we've done that once already, and I think we'll do it again at some point. It is a good approach. And again, that's part of how our RFP works also, is theoretically that's a competition, although it's not exact competition. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, any other public testimony? It looks like the answer is yes. Please once again introduce yourself and welcome.
John Stokes, Universal Big Project, AI, VR, and blockchain. So digital identity management is a really interesting conversation. So it's like government talking about governance, because that's kind of what the core of a digital identity and the extension of what that represents is governance. So one of the, I guess, complex topics that should be brought to service is the data that comes from the extension of the digital identity, and how that data is managed, and who has access to this data and the rights to this data. And this lady over here brought up interesting and relevant points that I'd like to expand upon. Once we get into the realm of AI and algorithms having access to our personal data, we kind of get into a really dangerous and slippery slope. So kind of give you like a scary scenario. Imagine Wells Fargo, one of these big banks, having access to all of your personal banking transactions, and they're using their algorithms to process how you use that money, and then they use this data to make market moves against their customers. So this is kind of like one of many negative potentials when we have unrestricted or unregulated access to personal data. So what I want to propose is parameters set in place for algorithm access to personal data. And that could be some kind of like AI safety certification, and one of the criteria that would be important to have is abstraction. So the data that these algorithms have access to would be abstracted, so they can have serious consequences. So imagine a rogue algorithm having access to all the SIM data and causing interesting market situations. So thanks.
Any questions? I think one key concept is best practices on anything you want to go forward with for digital identity is not going to provide open access to the information that you have. You would have to be authoritatively granting access to, for example, your shopping history. We want to make sure that you can provide your shopping history if you want them to know your shopping history, and then when you don't anymore, you need to be able to stop them. So I certainly agree that the last thing we would want would be for it to be third-party collected and then just openly used by anybody that's looking.
So I'm suggesting like the companies that you do grant access to, make sure that they're certified their algorithms are certified to properly handle the data. And this is one of the conversations we're having with the IEEE on defining the criteria for AI's certification.
I don't know, you can do that from a legal standpoint, but boy, you should be challenged, and maybe not. I mean, maybe there's a way to revoke authoritatively, but it's kind of like the problem that you have with anything. Once I see it, I have the opportunity to know it, and I have the opportunity to store that data somewhere else. So as long as somebody's adhering to the rules, you can revoke. But somebody who wants to break the rules, once they read the information, you're probably going to be challenged to authoritatively revoke.
Well, maybe these actors don't intend to break the rules.
When you have good actors, right, good algorithms, good actors will end up following it. I guess the only concern I have is that it's pretty challenging to write something that, in that case, that precludes the bad actor from doing bad things with it.
It would just, I think there could be some kind of certification process for it.
Absolutely. Any further questions? Further questions? See none? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Let's go over to you. Please introduce yourself once again. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Scott Moeller, CEO of MShift. Based in Silicon Valley, our history is mobile banking, so millions upon millions of secure financial transactions over the years. The first thing that comes to me is, as we discuss digital identity, and my apologies, this is my first meeting of the Wyoming Blockchain Task Force, so if this has been discussed before, I appreciate that we're on the same page. My first thought was how can digital identity hit significant scale? And really, in order to scale, these digital identity transactions need to be zero cost within the ecosystem. And that is very difficult when the blockchain requires an incremental transaction cost for any change of event within the ecosystem. So when I hear comments about 2 cents, 2 cents, 2 cents, it doesn't seem that much on an individual basis. But if every email that you send or receive costs 2 cents, it adds up pretty quick. So the first point. Second point, in any system, you have to have a clear method in order to validate the humanity of the individual. Enabling an individual to have sole self-enrollment leaves open opportunities for fraud. Also in a pseudo-anonymous system, you also have the opportunity for bots to be entered into the ecosystem. And while that may be beneficial to someone that is receiving revenues off of advertising in the ecosystem, it's not beneficial to within the ecosystem. So the process to verify and certify is a key issue. I fully agree with you, Mr. Chairman, in terms of enabling the holder of the identity to choose how much information they share. There also needs to be a method to check that the credential hasn't been used in a prior instance on chain for establishment of another identity. So just some of the issues, I don't know if you've already discussed all these through or not.
We've touched on several of them, but certainly good points, and there's so many things that we have to deal with. Any questions? Questions? Seeing none? Thanks. Anyone else like to provide testimony? All right. Go ahead. Introduce yourself once again.
Thank you, Chairman. This is Devin James from Alexandria Labs. I just wanted to say the one thing is it seems to me that the best way that the state can provide input into this is specifically when you do an RFP to do it in regards to the data itself, to the decentralized ID organization, simply because there are, like you said, picking winners can be dangerous this early, and there's even non-blockchain approaches to this. The guy that invented the web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, has an approach called Solid, and I just checked with Mr. Allen, and it's also part of the organization, and it has nothing to do with blockchains. It's that you run a node locally on your own computer in your own house, where all of your personal information, private information is kept, and anytime Facebook needs something, it asks for it, and so you completely maintain control over whether it is. And of course, there's programmatic ways to go about the same thing, but I don't think it's entirely clear across the board which one is the better solution, because to the gentleman's point just now, there's no incremental cost to sending it directly from your own computer. There's no TX fee to sending it directly from your own computer, so I would imagine it's actually going to be a combination of a lot of these things, and that's why the only way that you'll get the interoperability that you want with that combination is by standardizing at the standards layer and have the state say we want this standard and all the different applications fit the standard.
Mr. James, that's a strong point. We discussed it at one point also, the idea that blockchain is immutable. You can change things by basically saying we're changing that other thing, but that other thing is still there. Not everything, not all information should be permanent and immutable. We had that discussion another time with the idea that some of this stuff probably belongs in a well-kept database and is queried at zero cost. I think that's something that is understood. Your identity might need to be a very protected thing, but getting back, and this gets back to the zero cost. Some things can be easily zero cost because it is simply queried. But if you're doing a right transaction that is an important right transaction, maybe we want a cost associated with that so that it would preclude tampering or whatever else. And in some cases, you just want it to be a little more expensive than others. So I agree. There's a balance of different technologies. It doesn't need to be and shouldn't be all in blockchain just because blockchain is cool. There are other technologies that may be more appropriate as we move into space. And again, it's so early in exploratory phase, it's hard to figure out all the things that we need. Okay. Additional comment? Thank you very much. Are there any further questions, Mr. James? I'm going to run some other public comment first, and then we'll come back to you. Okay. Come on up. Welcome. Please introduce yourself. Good to see you.
Thank you guys for having me. Brittany Kaiser, co-founder of the Digital Asset Trade Association. We are a Wyoming 501c6 based in Cheyenne. So over the past 2 days of the task force, it's become very clear that there are going to be various sets of RFPs and application processes that are going to go from everything from the new special purpose depository institution licenses to 2 different types of sandbox funding to digital identity, et cetera, and so forth. All of the different blockchain applications and companies that could fulfill all of the needs that are now there based off of the new laws that we have. So as a member of data, we have spent many months actually looking into a way that we can help the state of Wyoming set standards for actually vetting those applications. We realize that from everything from data protection, which happens to be a very big topic that a lot of people have mentioned even today, to cybersecurity and blockchain protocols, to the quality of the executives and staff, capacity and ability to execute, to track record. All of those are different indicator sets that are going to go into your decision on who is going to win RFPs and who are going to get these licenses. Now that takes a large amount of capacity, especially because I do expect once all of your RFPs start to come out, you're going to have an extreme amount of interest from all over the country and perhaps even all over the world. Now, whether you're going to first accept Wyoming LLCs or you're going to be open to everyone, again, that's a decision that you can have, but we would love to offer our assistance in order to build your capacity to actually vet and have a valid set of indicators for judging those companies so that you can start to weed through who are actually the top and most qualified solutions and platforms and companies that could begin to fill all of these needs. Now, we have staffed up our steering committee, our legal advisory board, and our board of directors, where we now have former members of the FTC, the SEC, legal experts from all over the world, former members of the anti-fraud standards setting committee for the advertising industry, et cetera and so forth. So what we would actually look to do is begin a process where we would get together tons of experts like the people that are gathered here for the Wyoming Blockchain Stampede, and we would hold working groups in order to develop a set of indicators, agree with the state of Wyoming what those indicators are, and then actually help with hands on deck to help vet and decide to score every application or company on some of those indicators as a nonprofit that has no for-profit interests. So very happy to do that and really looking forward to seeing where all of this goes. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Ms. Kaiser. Any questions, Mr. Kaiser? Seeing none, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Deputy Wheeler, it seems that there's a lot of interest in the RFP. So as you're writing that up and working on that, you can have as many people review as you'd like. Look forward to working with you on that. Any additional public comment? Additional public comment? All right. Yes.
Going off of what the gentleman at the end was saying, I think when the type of software that's going to be used, instead of going on the concept of assuming all departments want to have access to this, I think in the very beginning it needs to be which ones do you want to be opted in, and if you want to change them at any time, you can. Or the consumer that's entering in the information. So if they don't want lots of different departments knowing all what they're doing, I think they should have that right. It is their information after all. And so that's all I was going to say, is that they should have the option in the beginning, not, oh, well, I didn't want them to know, and then somehow have to figure out how to opt out. It should be in the very beginning, I don't want these companies, and if I do, I have the option later on to opt in.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for the comment. Any additional public comment on this topic? Please join us. Introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
Matt Corba, I'm the General Counsel of Consensus. I will be brief. I know you guys are running late. Thank you for your time. I wanted to make a couple of quick points and one point of clarification. We participate in Hyperledger. We just put a larger open source project in there. One point of interest, if you are trying to avoid the big blue influence, the Hyperledger Technical Steering Committee, which oversees technical development of all the projects within Hyperledger, is now majority dominated by IBM. So IBM disavows control of Hyperledger, but if you look between the lines, that may not be true. Second big point I wanted to make was drawing on a point that Brad Burnham, influential tech investor, made several years ago, which is when we go down the road of architecting these systems, let's not invent new overlords. Let's figure out how to get rid of them. In the context of blockchains, I have heard lots of permissioned identity blockchains, and I think Indy purports to be one of these, where you would have essentially decentralization among 20 different, 30 different, 50 different nodes, those being institutions, corporations who we are supposed to trust. As a state of Wyoming, you don't want to run into a situation where these 20 hold you hostage as an identity cartel and say, if you want where identity is processed and logged. You have to do X, Y, Z. You have to conform to X, Y, Z. I understand Wyoming to be a state that likes to march to the beat of its own drum and pave the way and not be beholden to these other interests in the country, and that's something that I would look at beyond the application layer. I pay a lot of attention to the consensus mechanisms that are used and who you might be liable to. I think we have lots of severe concerns about identity cartels popping up if you have 20 different node operators and they will collude to extract value, because what is the value to them of running these nodes? So those are the points I wanted to make.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Any questions? Yeah, I agree. We definitely don't need to just change the structure of the market. We kind of need to resolve it. Thank you. All right. Mr. Allen, some quick comments?
So I want the task force to understand that, you know, these are all very valid concerns, and there's a fairly large community that are trying to address all these issues. And there are some very specific government organizations that are sympathetic with this. I found the British Columbia rules very interesting. They, for instance, do not allow any data sharing across departments. So even within their own thing, if the Secretary of State collects information, they must get explicit consent for, say, a different organization to get that same consumer or corporate information. So there's something called the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which is being worked right now, which has a lot of privacy and, you know, sort of the social credit type thing that's happening in China. So there are a wide variety of groups that are doing this type of stuff. In our own community, the 10 principles of self-sovereign identity is a very strong theme. Germany is beginning to adopt some of those principles, etc. So there is a lot of work there. But it'll be it's going to always require diligence. In my own experience, SSL TLS was supposed to be, breaking up the big cartels of Visa, MasterCard, and whatever. But then we now have, new cartels of Google and Apple and such. So, we have to keep the diligence up. We have to keep the principles forward, and we have to be careful.
So I have a question for you along those lines. With most of these other technologies, there were lots of different things going on, and then there was sort of a coalescence around a standard and a protocol. I mean, just think HTML, right? There's various markup languages, and then you had source you get together and say, all right, we're going to recognize these standards so that we don't have to have all these crazy browsers and everyone's doing dumb things and links that exist, right? So they got together, they eliminated linking to one another. And it's not, the government has nothing to do with it, and it's all open source. So why can't we have a digital identity protocol which is entirely consortium based, has nothing to do with a government, and we just adhere to the protocol. We just say, all right, we're compliant. The state of Wyoming will be compliant with DID 1.0 as outlined by C or whatever consortium ends up taking it.
And that is what is emerging. So the W3C is a different kind of organization than DIF and Indie Sovereign community is. So those are developer communities. They're implementing source, they're implementing things, and I know they get frustrated with me and others that we're saying, no, we have to go through a collaborative process where everybody gets listened to, every voice is in, and that addresses everybody's needs as much as possible. We'll never be perfect. So that, the fact that it took 2 years for verifiable credentials to become a global standard, they're going, wait a second, I implemented it 3 years ago. We're going, yes, but you forgot X, Y, and Z, which we did address. You didn't enable zero knowledge proofs. You didn't enable data minimization. You didn't do whatever. Yes, it worked 3 years ago, and it was decent 3 years ago. So we are very careful in the W3C to separate out code versus specifications. The W3C does not standardize on a library. In fact, for things to become a standard, you have to show that there are multiple libraries that support it. Ideally multiple entirely different languages that support it. And it can't become a global standard until it has that. We have that for verifiable credentials already. We passed all the tests. We've done the consensus. We've done the patent claims. That's another thing we haven't really talked about. If you go through the W3C process, you have to forego all the patent claims on anything that you have in the standard. So those things are emerging, and I think that's what Homeland Security, there are a lot of things I don't like about Homeland Security, but they've done a good job in this particular area of saying, yes, we don't really want to pick winners. We want to make sure that the standard wins, and that's kind of what happened with SSL TLS. Visa had their own protocol, their own key management scheme, and whatever. And what ended up winning was something where anybody could stand up a server, and there were multiple certificate authorities. And we do have to be careful, because despite our goodwill at that particular point, I don't think we realized how industry consolidation, where VeriSign bought like 20 other CAs, and Google stopped allowing us to delete CAs. I've been complaining for 4 years about that Kyrgyzstan CA in my browser, and it's only been the last few months that people are discovering, well, maybe we shouldn't have had the Kyrgyzstan browser CA in there. So we always have to be careful and look for those new forms of centrality and break them when they emerge. Because no matter how hard we work, somebody will try to figure out how to constrain it in some fashion. We'll fix it.
All right. Ms. Channing would like one more round. We need to conclude soon. I do feel like we could probably run on this topic for the rest of the week.
Mr. Chairman, there is that organization that's called the Digital Identity Foundation. It has 50 different companies in it. They are creating these standards. There's also some NIST standards. But what I'll leave you with is the simplest way for Wyoming to adopt this is to start small. Start with a single identity. Let's do that joint venture with CDOT and YDOT. You were very happy to contribute to it. It's an easy way to start. It's good one.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Any questions? Real quick. We're not going for round 3.
So digital identity surfaces like a whole new ecosystem of governance services, and it'll evolve to the point where we have decentralized, voluntary, borderless nations start emerging. So it'll get to the point where there'll be a marketplace where digital nations are competing for our citizenship. So that may be like 10, 20 years from now, but it should be points that should be thinking towards in the future, especially through points of addressing the antiquated system. So.
Thank you. Question? Yeah. All right, seeing none, thank you very much. All right, with that, let's close public testimony. Thank you, everyone. It's back to the committee. We don't have any actions, but we certainly have the opportunity for discussion if anyone would like to raise any points before we close or take any potential action. Committee? Everyone's a little tired. All right, seeing none. Mr. Co-Chairman, this brings us to the end of our agenda, to the end of the blockchain task force in the state of Wyoming. A good little budget amendment. I think it's productive. I'd like to thank everyone that's on the task force for all of the hard work. We've done, I think, an incredible service for the state of Wyoming. All the volunteer time and hard work that we've seen from this group has really paid off. I also want to thank the incredible participation of all of the public policy stakeholders, all the people that traveled to the state of Wyoming or came in remotely over the web and then provided do ask all of you to continue to work with us through this legislative process, because none of these bills that we just passed have passed anything. They're not law yet. We have a lot of work ahead. We've got more hearings. We've got standing committees. Then we've got to go to the legislative session, and we've got to take them through both chambers, and there's standing committees on each side. And then we've got to work the legislature and make sure that the House and a majority therein, and the Senate and a majority therein support this legislation that we've been working on. And we invite, once again, feedback, criticism, ways for improvement, anything that we can do better as we work through that process. So thank you, everyone. Mr. Cocher.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chairman. It's been kind of a wild process. I was actually thinking about that this morning, how we started down this road, and it's unfortunate Mr. Chris Land isn't here because yeah, it was a little bit involved. It was a little over 2 years ago, right around 2 years ago, I suppose. I called Chris. It was about this time of year. I actually just called LSO and I said I need to talk to one of the attorneys, whichever one is the geekiest. That's what I told the receptionist. They picked Chris. I don't know. But I remember Chris answered. He's like, "Hey, Representative Lemon, what can I do for you? As you know, I'm fairly new here." And I was like, "Well, I got this crazy idea of a bill, but I think it could be a big deal, Chris. What do you know about Bitcoin and blockchain?" Nothing, but I'll start reading. And he did, and you know, and over time, Mr. Shaw and Ms. Reveley have been really started, you know, taking over the drafting aspect. And I remember Mr. Shaw this last session came to me with like I don't know how many pages long of an amendment. It was a cleanup. They just poured over a 40-page bill, and he's like, "Oh, by the way, here's some cleanup language that otherwise none of this works." So a Herculean effort, and then going on to the agencies who have had to put up with what we produced and tried to make our vision a reality. So none of this, and then on top of that, the public, the countless hours. Ms. Long, when you first started on this deal, the countless hours that you poured in for free, that you continue to pour in for free. On this whole rodeo, it is kind of bittersweet. We're putting this dog to bed. This is its last day. The Blockchain Task Force is officially dead, which is kind of sad. But we also know that we're expanding, and so that premise will be much larger, hopefully next year. Or Representative Olson and Senator Rothfuss will be running budget amendments again.
Yeah,
and,
no, waste on this.
and that was actually kind of the fascinating experience, is how this task force was first formed. Is we had no idea if the blockchain bills that first year were going to be successful whatsoever. So we got like halfway through, and all these random people started showing up in Wyoming. And we had this outfit called Block Pressure Lab show up, and they're like, "Yeah, we just moved our business here." And so we're like, "Whoa, I think this works." It was a fascinating thing. So Senator Rothfuss, Representative Olson, Ms. Long, and several others, we all put our heads together, and how can we run the ball on this? Because really, to be honest, I don't mind staying on conference calls, but to be honest, we do a better job in this format versus myself and Ms. Long staying up late at night on conference calls trying to decide what the best. And we end up completely changing that bill, by the way, because that's not the best way to draft legislation, as it turns out. But just the same, so we moved the Blockchain Task Force forward there, and that was the last task force that has been created via budget. Thanks to Governor Gordon vetoing that same action that happened in the last supplemental budget when they tried to create it. They tried to replicate what the Blockchain Task Force did, and Governor Gordon vetoed those efforts.
They can't.
No, they can't compete with us. So, although this is the end of the Blockchain Task Force, newer horizons and bigger horizons are out there. I would say that for our citizens that have joined us as appointments from the governor, I sincerely hope that if we get our bill through, that all three of you reapply to Governor Gordon to be appointed to that select committee. I can't even remember what the heck we called that thing, but we changed the name. It's a big long name. We should have come up with something that, I don't know, an acronym or something. So that's the plan. Like like I said, kind of bittersweet. I hope everybody sticks around for this weekend for the hackathon, the Wyoming Stampede. Over 200 grand is going to be given away in 48 hours. So hold on to your hats. It's going to be wild. And it'll be a really good time and educational. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll shut up.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Committee, anyone else want to make any comments before we close? Any additional comments? All right, staff, any actions we need to take? Anything you need to know from us? All right. We'll do that after the close, and then I'll say that right now. So we're going to adjourn, but we have a demonstration afterwards, which is an official part of the blockchain task force. But Ms. Channing is going to provide a demonstration of some of the stuff she talked about yesterday with consensus, and it's the say it one more time what the title of it was.
Yeah, I'll just cover some on-chain voting stuff and talk about just some topics that we've covered here, kind of from the perspective of here.
Excellent. And so we're going to have that presentation right here immediately upon adjournment.
Yes, please.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Blockchain task